I'm a product of the 60s, so I thought I was pretty hip. I mean, you know, I was on Oprah Winfrey a few years ago, and the last question she said, Edgar, you know, have you ever smoked pot? And I said, yeah, Oprah, I'm a product of the 60s. And I said, you know, unlike the former president of the United States, I did inhale. I thought it was the purpose.
The descendant of a family of industrial giants, an advisor to Presidents Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon, the one-time owner of the Denver Broncos and the Vancouver Whitecaps, multimillionaire Edgar Kaiser threw it all over 26 years ago to devote his life to promoting a better understanding of the link between addiction and mental illness. We met him at the Ranchman Club in Calgary, Alberta.
Edgar, I wanted to start by asking about your childhood because as the grandson and the son of two very dynamic industrialists, I have to assume that your childhood wasn't like the average childhood, that there must have been something different about it. Was there?
Well, yes, in some ways there were, because we were then and are a family company, even though many of our businesses were publicly traded. And my grandfather was a great believer in, you know, learning the business from the ground up. So that I didn't attend grade school so often. I traveled with my father on business trips and granddad. So I had to play catch up on my schooling, but I got a different kind of schooling.
Yeah.
And it was really a great opportunity.
Tell me about some of that, though. What were some of those trips like? What sorts of things were you seeing and learning?
Well, after I was born in Portland, Oregon, during World War II, when we were building Victory ships and Liberty ships, and baby aircraft carriers, landing ship tanks for World War II. So I grew up in the shipyards, and then Granddad had decided that returning servicemen would need automobiles. So we went into the automobile business basically in Willow Run, Michigan. So we moved to Michigan. And
this is the Kaiser.
Well, it was Kaiser Fraser.
Okay.
Joe Fraser was a great promoter, and he talked my grandfather into going into the automobile business. Ultimately, Mr. Fraser disappeared, and we went on with Kaiser Fraser. But I would spend weekends out at the office with Dad and in the plant, and then travel to our dealership meetings with him. And so I visited all of our dealers throughout North America. It was a struggle. We ended up, it ended up surviving. Kaiser Fraser and then Kaiser did, because we ended up with Jeep, Willys Overland, and we moved the tools and dies for the cars to Argentina and Brazil. So instead of assembling cars there, we had full foundries, etc. We were fully manufacturing. And in fact, in that part of the world, are given the credit for industrializing.
Well, in fact, it's
South
interesting.
America.
You know, I read about that. Now, this is not something that I know a lot about.
Yeah.
I'll be honest with you, but I did read about the fact that it was that activity and the way it was set up down there that was greatly respected by the people down there, because it wasn't seen as some foreigner coming in and exploiting cheap labor. It was a completely different business model.
It was. But in Argentina, Perón was in power when we went down there, and he tried to do a deal with my grandfather where all of his cronies became our partners. Granddad said, we don't do business that way, so I'm going home. And by the way, in those days, that was a long flight. Jets didn't exist. Anyway, Perón did give in, and we didn't do it his way. But Evita, on a weekend, said to my father, you know, your son ought to be meeting younger people. So do you mind if I take him and I stayed with her as her guest in the Pink Palace, as Evita's Perón guest?
Well, now, what was that like?
In that way, it wasn't like that.
No,
it wasn't like that. But it's a fascinating story. So in that way, I had a really fortunate childhood in being exposed some truly interesting people from a very young age.
Were you interested in the business aspects of it that you were seeing at that point? Because I have to assume that most young men at that point would go, Right. Tools and dies, and But were you interested in it, fascinated by it?
No, I mean, certainly there were times when my raging hormones weren't particularly happy about being out in a construction job in the middle of nowhere or working in some factory. But basically, yes, I was fascinated by it, and I believed in the values by which we operated the companies, and saw that not as an obligation or a problem, but a real opportunity.
Yeah.
Because most people in life just want the chance to participate, and by sheer dint of birthright, God gave that to me on the go, and that was a real gift to be able to participate.
Now, you talk about the spottiness of your formal education at that point in your life, but you still got an education, and you still ended up at Harvard.
Well, it's a little worse than that even, because I'm dyslexic, which I didn't know then.
Oh.
So I barely got into Stanford, and I had real trouble the first few years until I got into lecture courses. And without knowing it, you offset one problem with another, so I remember what I hear. So in lecture courses, I got very good grades from there on out.
Huh.
And Harvard was basically, using the case system and debating in class, a lecture course system. So the Harvard Business School was a good experience. I graduated, but I wasn't there because when my class graduated, I was already in Vietnam. So I missed that.
Now again, you volunteered for that, did you not? To go over there with USAID, was
I did. Yeah. Well, I was paid by AID.
And so, what were you doing when you were there?
Well, actually, we called it Black Operations, and as I say, I was paid by AID.
Okay,
that's not who I worked for.
Okay, I get it now. All right. So, can you talk about what you were doing there?
Yeah,
even to this day.
Yeah, no, I can. The group that I worked with, which was a multi-nation group, meaning the Koreans, the Australians, the Vietnamese, and some Americans. Our job was to determine whether or not, from an economic standpoint, we were or were not winning the war. And that also meant being in areas where we were going to carpet bomb, we would go in ahead of time and be there. And, if the bombs didn't hit us, great. But, I did not believe in the war. And as I told my grandfather, he said, "Why are you going? This is crazy." And I said, "No, I think this is going to be an important part of our country's history. And I also think it's the dying seeds of American colonialism." Mm-hmm. So I think this is crazy, but I'm not going to understand it by being here or going to Canada. And I know the only way I'm going to get a feel for it is being there. And it was miserable, frankly.
How old were you at this point? Early 20s, maybe?
Yeah, early 20s. Okay. Early 20s.
Okay. And how long were you there?
I did 2 tours, and then a friend who was the director of the Alumni Association at Stanford on home leave met up with me and said, "Listen, I know you. You're not going to quit. You're going to stay there, until something happens. If you really want to make a difference, there's a program called the White House Fellows Program, in which you're picked from across the country to be an assistant to the president, the vice president, or the members of the cabinet." I was fortunate enough to be chosen, and I was also fortunate enough to get the White House.
Yeah.
So I worked with President Johnson, and then he put me on the transition team. There were 3 of us that worked with the Nixon guys at the Pierre Hotel up in New York.
Yeah.
And the President-elect called me in the day before he came down to Washington for the inauguration and said, "Look, Haldeman and Ehrlichman hate you, but your father was the second highest contributor to the Democrats, but you've really been a help. And will you stay? And because we need you."
Were you gobsmacked by that? I would have been. The fact that he was offering that branch to you, and
well, he was right. They did come after me.
Did they? Yeah.
Oh yeah. But I did stay. I mean, how are you going to say no to the president?
Right.
And then I ended up being transferred to the Department of Interior. The former governor of Alaska had just been appointed Secretary of the Interior when the Santa Barbara oil spill occurred. Mm-hmm. So I went over there, and by mistake, I got into his office instead of being caught by all the retinue. And he looked up from his desk and he said, "Who are you?" And I said, "I'm Edgar Kaiser." And he said, geez, you're a lot younger than I thought you'd be. And I said, no, Mr. Secretary, I'm not my father. And he said, well, there's this problem. The president's worried about this oil spill in Santa Barbara. So he said, there's a Jetstar waiting for you at Andrews Air Force Base. Get out there, kid, and then call me and tell me about it. So I did. And I called him from the Coast Guard helicopter and said, look, this is serious, boss. Get out here, and by the time you get here, I'll have a briefing organized for you, which happened. Flying back to Washington, he said, you know, Edgar, I don't have any undersecretary or assistant secretaries. I don't have a chief of staff. You know, I'm from Alaska. You seem to know your way around here. You want to be my chief of staff? Well, you know, I was all of 24 years old, and of course I can do this. You know, so I said yes. And it was fascinating.
Yeah?
Yeah.
And then your father comes and asks you to come and help out with some of the problems in the family companies.
No, he didn't,
no?
actually.
Okay.
No, it wasn't Dad.
Oh, well, okay.
Two of our lead bankers, names that you would know, came to see me saying, look, we know you don't intend to work for Kaiser. You've always gone off and done your own thing. But your dad's in trouble, and the companies are in trouble, and we think you can help out. So we'd like you to come back. I did, and that led me to our biggest trouble, which was Kaiser Resources, the coal mine and port near Vancouver, and the coal mine in the East Kootenay, which you'll be near tomorrow.
Yeah.
And it turned out to be our biggest company.
Yeah. You had a period, I mean, when you did get involved, and it's interesting because the record pretty much indicates, no matter where you look, that it was your father who asked you to come back, which I think is an interesting wrinkle in all of this.
Yeah.
Was he happy that you came back, that you were coming back into the family fold in a way at the time?
I think he was very sensitive to nepotism, and so he never actually promoted me. It was the outside directors who did.
Right.
And that's really the truth.
Yeah.
Saying, look, you know, this kid's been saying this trouble's going to happen for a couple of years now, Edgar. Give him the responsibility. You know, what have you got to lose?
Yeah. And you came back in and had to do some tough stuff. You were quoted, I know, in the time, in the Los Angeles Times, in a piece they did on you. You were quoted as saying that in there was probably the worst year and a half of your life.
Yeah, I mean, because I was given the problem children of the companies, and I'd worked in all of those companies as a kid, as a laborer, et cetera, and I knew the people, and we had to reduce our employees, and so you know, I met with the people in small groups myself, and it was very emotional for them and me, but I have to say, including the union group, they didn't disagree. They knew that we were overstaffed, and there was a lot of fat, and that was true at the executive level too. So, no, it wasn't. I mean, it was reorganizing our group, getting the company sold off, taking us private as we are now. That was 12 hard years.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah.
That sort of thing takes a toll on you personally too, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yes, it took a toll on you?
Yes, it did.
Yeah,
it did.
All right, I want to talk to you about what happened from 1985 to now, because as I read about you, it seems that round about that time you had an epiphany. Someone the way I read it, and again, I don't trust the record anymore now after what you've told me, but the way I have read it is that a family member who had drug problems came to you in pretty dire straits.
Yes.
Tell me what happened.
Well, you know, I'm a product of the 60s, so I thought I was pretty hip. I mean, you know, I was on Oprah Winfrey a few years ago, and the last question, she said, Edgar, you know, have you ever smoked pot? And I said, yeah, Oprah, I'm a product of the 60s. And I said, you know, unlike the former president of the United States, I did inhale. I thought it was the purpose. And everybody cracked up because nobody could believe I would say that, but I did because it was the truth. But and then ended up owning the Denver Broncos, and we had a pretty progressive program there in terms of keeping issues inside the family, not moralizing about them, but saying this is a health issue. It's not a moral issue, and having a good treatment program, which is much of the model is followed today by the NFL, but improved upon. when the family member had trouble, I went to the commissioner, then Pete Rozelle, and said, look, I love this, but I need to sell the Broncos because I really want to go to work on this. Anyway, against Pete's protestations, I did.
Yeah.
And the story has a happy ending. The family member is very healthy and productive today. But in the process of that, said, we can do something about this. This is really very important. And it recognized that the problem of mental health and addictions was true in our family. It was true in our companies. And as in most cases, as you know, medical systems, it's very easy to get drugs. Mm-hmm. So it's true there, too, in our hospital system. So formed then the Kaiser Foundation, called the Substance Abuse Foundation.
Right.
We subsequently changed the name because that was a pejorative term, but saying, look, mental health and addictions are public health issues. They're not moral issues. Now, while someone is addicted, they may commit immoral acts. But to be an addict is not immoral. And recognizing that the mind and mental health, early childhood development, has a huge part of addictive personalities. So, for example, if I went to Betty Ford to stop drinking, it may not stop me from an addictive habit of being a smoker. So, it's part of that.
Yeah.
It is horribly costly, this subject. And both governments and the public at large don't realize what it costs. Furthermore, it's not just the people you see on the street. If you take the downtown Eastside in Vancouver and you go to West Vancouver, where we live, people there are doing it too. You just don't see them because they can afford to do it behind closed doors.
Yeah.
So you don't see them on the street. And this is something that we as society, in conjunction with governments, do need to work on. 40% of white-collar workers are addicted to prescription drugs. So it's not just them, it's us.
Yeah.
It's we.
Yeah.
What would you say it costs, for example, in the cost to society, to mental health and addictions annually in Canada costs the country?
Haven't got a clue. Can you put a figure on it?
Yeah, I can.
Okay.
And there are variations.
All right.
Because it depends what you put in there. Mm-hmm. What do you count? And doing this, so to make a long story short, 70 to 80 billion annually. The only thing that costs more in healthcare is heart disease. And how much of heart disease is caused by these other problems? Yeah. So this is a labor of love and importance to do it. It's still hard to get people to talk about it. It's the ugly cousin you keep in the closet.
Yeah.
The more we can shed light on it, it's like walking across a room. If the lights are out, you can run into the furniture and bark your shins. But if you turn the lights on in the room, you can avoid the furniture. And we're dedicated to turning the lights on in the room.
I got to ask you about the gestalt out there now, to use a 60s term.
We're dating ourselves.
We are dating ourselves. That's okay. In Vancouver, the controversy that continues now, and as we sit here in June talking about this, we don't know what the Supreme Court is going to rule on this, but the controversy over the safe injection site in Vancouver is now before the Supreme Court. We know that now that Stephen Harper has a majority government, we know how this government feels about things like this. They don't like them. The sense is that there is a great resistance towards these sorts of harm reduction programs on the part of a lot of governments. Are you fighting an uphill battle in this?
Well, we're not harm reductionists.
No,
we're in favor of reducing the harm associated with inappropriate mental and addictive behaviors, and there's a difference there.
Okay.
So, for example, needle exchanges make sense in terms of Hep C, HIV/AIDS, right, don't they? Now, safe injection sites, if properly run, which exist, as we know, in other countries. If it gives you a way to get at the addict, right, so you can see them and talk to them. If they have a place to go, if you've got housing associated with it, which we did not have at Insight in the early stages, meant that it was far less effective than it could have been, and it still needs to be improved upon. The other thing is to have an open door policy. This is an emotional field, and if you take the psychologists, psychiatrists, the neuroscientists, etc., and how the brain affects what we all do, particularly from early childhood on, and then we look at addictions on the other side, you have a schism between the two of them. Well, we don't do that here. But we need to be able to do that there because there are different modalities that need to be used, so that we have to develop within each society and community an open door policy where if you walk in here, that's not exactly what we do here, but okay, that's your problem, come on over here and we'll help you there because you get into the right door. In order to do that, we need to train the people, and they need to be evaluated so that we are funding the right programs, particularly in addictions, with all of the genuine belief and commitment and emotionalism. Many people are not really trained, and they're not evaluated on the effects of what happens. We need to do that. Yeah. And we know enough to know how to. So we have to convince people of that.
I got to ask you about this. Just occurred to me as you were describing that. If you watch, and I hate to characterize it this way, but it is what it is. American television.
Yep.
There are any number of shows now that, and glorify isn't the right word, but certainly capitalize, exploit, if you like, people with addictions and addictive personalities. There are shows on, A&E about interventions, and they're all this sort of, and there doesn't seem to be a paucity of people with various addictions to various substances who are willing to appear in all of their glory in the public eye and show people what it's like. Now, do you think, my reaction to those things is, I don't think that helps. I don't think that's making the greater society any more understanding of those people. I think it's just there for entertainment. But what do you think? Do those things?
I agree with you completely.
Yeah?
I don't think it is helpful. And furthermore, the practices aren't all right. I mean, this is a complicated subject. It's not simple. Now, having said that, does that mean because it's complicated we shouldn't deal with it? I mean, it's like Indigenous Canadians. As you know, we have an Indigenous Canadian program in the North in partnership with a number of different universities led by Indigenous Canadians, supported by Health Canada, the RCMP, and the Department of National Defense. Well, what we measure in the North are inputs, but we don't measure a baseline and then outcomes. What are we really getting for what we're doing? Now, it's going to be slow because it has to be led by consensus and by Indigenous Canadian people. Doesn't mean it isn't worthwhile. We need to do it. So, no, I agree with what you said about the shows that are on TV, much like the ads, or I should say the public service announcements that you see on U.S. television. They're aimed at the wrong market. If you're a person with a problem, you're not watching that TV show.
Yeah.
So if you're going to do a PSA, the ones that we produce, for example, for our partner, CTV, are aimed at the audience that cares about a person with a problem. You aim at that person because they're thinking, they're worried. But the person with a real problem, they're not watching that.
Yeah. Two programs coming from various administrations in the United States, the war on drugs and Just Say No.
Well, how do you declare a war on your own people? That's ridiculous. I mean, okay, we're declaring war on our own people, number one. Number two, there's nothing wrong with Just Say No. For some people, it's the right thing, but not for all people. Now, if you look at the money that's on the other side of it, we're not going to be able to defeat the suppliers of the drugs. That's not going to happen. There's too much money. And in fact, in the process, by consuming, we're destroying, we're creating anarchy in Mexico, Costa Rica, Colombia, Peru, Bolivia. I mean, it's ridiculous what's going on because we're really hurting those governments. We're financing guys who are bad guys. So some form of getting this under control means you got to work on consumption, and
does that mean legalization in some instances?
In some instances, it does mean legalization. Not in all, but in some, yes, it does. But for example, what you probably smoked as a joint when you were a kid and what the kids are smoking today is completely different. Not only that, so nobody knows what's in it. You don't know what's in it. You're promoting it through a black market. Get a control. Yes, you can tax it. Now, you can't tax it heavily because it's not expensive. It's a weed. But it is true you can get some revenue out of it. But it seems to me we had to learn something from Prohibition. And,
you would think, wouldn't you?
Yeah, you would think we should learn something from it. So, yes, in other words, we do believe that these issues should be looked at. We also believe that just the nomenclature of war on drugs is unhealthy. It's really not a war on drugs, right? We're declaring a war on addicts.
Yeah.
Not on drugs, it's on addicts.
Yeah.
And if we incarcerate a person versus rehabilitate them, it's 7 times more costly to put a person in prison than to fix them.
Well, we're going to have more prisons in this country, so there'll be a place to put them all, apparently.
Isn't that good news?
All right, let me ask you in our last minute then.
Okay.
I came into this before I met you thinking, here's a guy who made a radical change in his life. 1984 was a watershed mark for him. He was a different guy before that than he has been since. Now I'm not so sure that that's true. Are you the same guy now that you were back then, just with a different agenda?
Yeah, basically, yeah, I am. I mean, I just think this is terribly important. And no, it's not as lucrative, but it is a really important subject. And it's not that society, meaning that we're all bad people now, but look at the pressures that are on society today that weren't 50 years ago. I mean, if you're a kid growing up in Vancouver, where are you going to live? You can't afford housing. So you've got to live with your folks. I mean, there's a lot of pressures in society today that are enormous, and in the world, uncertainty. So this problem is growing by leaps and bounds. It's not going to go away.
Yeah.
So I've got work for the rest of my life.
Well, it's been a great pleasure to meet you, Edgar. I appreciate you doing this. Thank you very much.
Thank you for giving us the time. We appreciate it very much.
Okay.